Now, after gaining an understanding of the type and number of computations by discussing some basic examples, now we are ready to perform the same thing for the n-point DFT equation, which can be written in the matrix form like this one, where we are multiplying the W and matrix with a time domain vector in order to get the frequency domain DFT coefficients. Now, the first thing which we have to do is we have to identify the nature of this matrix and this vector, whether this matrix and vector contains some complex numbers or some real numbers. So as we already know, this W matrix simply contains discrete complex exponentials. So the nature of this W matrix will definitely be a complex nature because it contains complex numbers. Now let's come to the time domain vector. This time domain sequence can contain both real valued data or a complex valued data depending on which type of signal we are going to analyze. So this time domain vector could contain real values or complex values. But in order to cover the maximum possible number of computations, we are assuming that our x of n is also a complex valued sequence. As we discussed earlier, the requirement of computations in complex numbers is more than the requirement of computations in real numbers, because we know one complex addition is equal to two real additions. Similarly, one complex multiplication is equal to four real multiplications and two real additions. Now, the question is why we want to cover the maximum possible number of computations. So the answer is, after performing computational analysis, our next step will be to find the processor speed. Now, if we have covered the maximum possible number of computations uh, by considering that our x of n is a complex valued sequence during our calculations, then the resultant processor will be able to handle both complex valued data and a real valued data. The same processor can be used for the analysis of both complex valued sequence and a real valued sequence. But if we will assume our x of n is a real valued sequence and then we will perform all the calculations, then the resultant processor would not be able to handle a complex valued data in real time. That processor will be able to handle only real valued sequences. So in order to use the same processor for both complex valued sequences and for real valued sequences, we have to cover the maximum possible number of computations, which will definitely be happened in the case of complex valued sequences. That's why we have assumed that the nature of both W matrix and a time domain vector is complex. Now let's start identifying the number of computations involved in n-point DFT equation. The first computation which we have selected is the number of complex multiplications. So we have to identify how many complex multiplications will be performed by our computer during an n-point DFT analysis. And as we already know, this W matrix is a square matrix which contains n rows and n columns. So in each of the computations, we will identify or count number of computations for a single row, and then we will multiply that formula simply by n in order to get the number of computations for the whole matrix, because this matrix contains n number of rows, and that particular formula will provide the required computations for the n-point DFT. So let's start with the complex multiplications for a single row. You can consider any single row in this matrix. You can take the first one, second one, or any other row. So let's consider we are going to multiply the first row with this time domain vector, and our task is we have to count the number of multiplication operations. And as we have already discussed, that we are assuming that the nature of both W matrix and this time domain sequence is complex. So both the matrix and the vector contains complex numbers. So when the first element of the first row of this matrix wn00 will be multiplied with the first sample value of this vector, which is x of 0, so this will be the first multiplication operation. Similarly, when the second element of this matrix will be multiplied with the second element of this vector, this will be the second multiplication operation. Similarly, when the last element or when the nth element of this first row will be multiplied with the last element or the nth element of this vector, that will be the nth complex multiplication operation. So in simple words, for a single row, there are n complex multiplication operations, and for the whole matrix we can simply multiply n by n, which will make it n square. So in n-point DFT, the requirement of complex multiplications are n square. Now let's come to the number of complex additions in n-point DFT. Let's take a case of single row. As we already know how x of 0 is computed, when the first row of this W matrix will be multiplied with the time domain vector, we will get the result of x of 0. But how x of 0 will be computed? We will need to add the n product terms which are obtained by multiplying the first row of this matrix with this time domain vector, because the multiplication of wn00 with x of 0 will provide the first product term. Similarly, the multiplication of wn01 with x of 1 will provide the second product term. Similarly, wn02 when will be multiplied with x of 2 will provide the third product term. Similarly, when the last element or when the nth element of this first row will be multiplied with the last element of this vector, it will provide the nth product term. So on multiplying a single row of this matrix with a time domain vector, we will get n product terms which we are required to add in order to get a single frequency domain coefficient value. So for adding n number of product terms, we will need n minus 1 complex additions, which are just for a single row. So to add n number of complex product terms, we need n minus 1 complex addition operations. Now for n number of rows, we can simply multiply n minus 1 with n, which will provide n square minus n complex additions. So in the n-point DFT, n square minus n complex additions are required to be performed. Now the total number of complex computations, which includes both complex multiplications and complex additions, will be n square plus n square minus n, where this n square is representing complex multiplication and this n square minus n is representing number of complex additions, which will make it 2n square minus n. So in n-point DFT, the total number of complex computations are 2n square minus n. Now let's come to the real computations. Basically, our computer cannot perform complex computations directly. Those complex computations will be performed in the form of real computations, including real multiplications and real additions. So for now, we are going to develop a formula of real multiplications in n-point DFT. And as we discussed in earlier slides, one complex multiplication is equivalent to 4 real multiplications and 2 real additions. So how many real multiplications will be there for a single row? It's very simple. We also discussed in earlier slides, for a single row there will be n complex multiplications, but those n complex multiplications will be performed in the form of real multiplications. So for a single row, there will be 4 into n real multiplications. How we have obtained this formula? We have simply multiplied n complex multiplications with 4, because we know one complex multiplication contains 4 real multiplications. So this is the case of single row. for the whole matrix or for n number of rows, we can simply multiply 4n with n, which will provide us 4n square real multiplications. So whenever we will perform n-point DFT, these many real multiplications will be required to perform. Now let's come to the last type of computation, which is real additions. Now real additions will be utilized at two stages. Firstly, when we have to perform complex addition, then real additions will be used, because we already know one complex addition contains two real additions. Similarly, when we have to perform complex multiplication, then in that case real additions will also be used there. Although our main objective is not the addition operation, we want to multiply two complex numbers, but in order to get the final result, we have to perform four real multiplications and two real additions. So how we can write the formula of real additions for a single row?